So thank you very much, Fiona Hill, for this wonderful speech, very inspiring. You wrote a best-selling memoir in 2021, which was called Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century. And this was part your own autobiography, part your ideas, part your analysis of where are we in society, in the world today. And now you gave us a lecture on resilience, the importance of education for resilient societies, the importance of knowledge, and the risks in which we are right now, that all this gets marginalized, really, and how the Fundación Ramón Areces, the Center for European Studies at Harvard, are examples of institutions that pursue this very important ideal. Durham University, you are doing also this job. Maybe it would be interesting, just for starting our conversation here, if you can summarize us your ideas when you wrote this best-selling memoir on your own realization in life, your own travel, your own journey, which has been so interesting, so varied, and right now also with these responsibilities. I think this could be also a good example for many other people.
No, well, thank you very much, Jose Maria. I didn't initially set out to write a memoir, to be honest. I work in a policy think tank at the Brookings Institution. I initially set out to write a policy book because I was trying to explain how the US and Russia were starting to look more like each other, which was, something of a surprise even for me as somebody who has been working on the Soviet Union and Russia for a very long time. I started studying Russian in 1984, and I was becoming more and more worried that the United States was heading down a very similar path in my in my time there. I wouldn't have thought that when I first got to the United States in 1989, but certainly my experience in the first Trump administration gave me a lot of pause for thought. And I was wanting to try to explain to myself at first, how was it that we got an authoritarian system in Russia? Because in the 1990s, Russia looked like it might be actually on a very different trajectory. If we look back to the 1980s and the reforms of Mikhail Gorbachev, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the emergence of a new Russia under Boris Yeltsin, the creation of political parties, efforts at economic reform, more pluralism in the society. For a while, it looked like Russia was heading in a different direction. But what became clear to me in my studies of Russia was that there was an underlying set of challenges and issues that were going to be very hard to overcome. And a lot of people, a majority of people, felt displaced and that their lives had been upended by the shock therapy of the 1990s and the dramatic changes in the economy. And eventually, they came to want to have something that was much more traditional in Russian political culture, a heavy hand from the top. And that you started to see people become more and more supportive of Vladimir Putin, irrespective of all of the repression that he carried out. And although Putin isn't as popular always as he seems, he's certainly more popular than anyone else. And although people are not exactly happy with the war in Ukraine, they still see Putin very much as the symbol of the state, and they've accepted this very top-down vertical of power there. And I started to see in the United States more and more people become angry and dissatisfied at the state of their democracy. Democracy is not delivering, which is exactly the same thing you hear here or you hear in Germany. People feeling that their lives were upended by the rapid change, a lot of grievances, and wanting somebody to be decisive and to be in charge. And people voting for Trump in 2016 elections because they wanted someone to fix the problems. And that remains the case. People voted for Trump again in the recent elections because they thought he was more likely the person to take action. And even 100 days into Trump's presidency, where most of us see chaos and crisis and unpredictability and have no idea where this is going, a majority of Trump's supporters are still very happy with the fact that he's taking action, because they feel that their lives were upended like people in Russia, and that they want somebody to do something about it, and they're very happy that he's doing something about it, even though it might not be exactly working out the way that they want. And I saw the same thing happening in the United Kingdom prior to this in 2016 with Brexit. I mean, I think for most people here, Brexit seems incomprehensible. But for people in Northern England who felt that nothing was ever done for them, 50 years plus of no change whatsoever, the north of England became impoverished overnight and has remained that way for 50 plus years. Successive governments have done absolutely nothing, and it was easy to blame all of this on the European Union, but it was really a protest vote, basically saying that nothing has been done for me. And the title of the book, There's Nothing for You Here, was what my father said to me when I was leaving school in 1984, that if I went to university, at that time only 10% of the population went to university, and if I got an education, there would be nothing for me in my home region, that I should go somewhere else to find a future, because all of the promise was in the past. And so in trying to sort of thinking about what I was seeing happening in Russia, in the United Kingdom, and in the United States, I started falling back on my own personal experiences, because it gave a kind of an insight that I don't think I would have had if I'd just been studying this as an academic. And basically my father left school at 14 to become a coal miner. He went down the mines in 1947, and basically he lost his job in the coal mines 3 or 4 times, then went to work in a brickworks and a steelworks, all of which were tied to the larger industry of the mines, and he never got retrained. And so in his 30s, he became a hospital porter, because he couldn't find a skilled job, because his skills in the coal mines didn't translate into anything else. And that was at the very lowest rung of the employment market. So there was never any chance to get a new skilled job. And all of the people around my father who had been coal miners or working in other nationalized industry, my father was actually quite an optimistic person, and he actually did get a job and basically was happy to have a job. But so many of the people that he had worked with were very resentful. And then the next generations, also didn't have jobs. They didn't, they didn't have the skills or the skill sets. The educational system wasn't set up, to help them to get new skills to work in the knowledge economy. And kind of basically people who would have before that worked in mines or steelworks or in shipbuilding end up going to work in Amazon super warehouses, or they go to work in light manufacturing that eventually disappears as well, or they go to work in call centers, or become delivery workers, and find themselves not in kind of in a way to be able to move forward. And that's the kind of vicious circle. So I started to decide that maybe using my personal experience would perhaps illustrate more the kind of problems that we were facing, and perhaps more readable than the policy book that I'd set out to actually write about.
So let me ask you also, before we open up to the audience, about your expertise on Russia and the Ukraine. How do you see the current negotiations, the prospects of the relationship between Europe and Russia, and the US and Russia?
So it's actually a little complicated to talk about the administration per se, because I think there's probably a lot of different views around Trump about Putin and Russia, and some of these you see, when you're seeing some of the reporting in the press and stuff here. But Trump himself has a very personal view of Vladimir Putin. On the one hand, he's the kind of leader that Trump himself would like to be. You've got to, remember, Trump himself has described himself as a king. And the Russian presidency was actually modeled on, in the 1996 constitution, on a constitutional monarch, but not the kind of constitutional monarch that we have in Spain or the United Kingdom, but a kind of monarch who is, the number one figure within the constitution, so the only sovereign decider. And that's exactly what Vladimir Putin has turned the Russian presidency in. The parliament is a rubber stamp. The Supreme Court equivalent, the Constitutional Court, just upholds the role of the presidency in Russia, and the judiciary basically applies the laws as the president of Russia decides. Now, if you look and listen very carefully, President Trump is saying exactly that that's what he sees the presidency in the United States. In fact, many of those around him have developed this theory of the unified executive, which in the days of George W. Bush was also a theory that was tried to put into practice, but it meant the executive branch, all the people who participated in it, and now it just means the president and means, in this case, Donald Trump. And, you know, Trump has this habit now. Go and have a look at the White House website and how much that has dramatically changed. He puts all kinds of memes of himself. Recently he put the Pope, himself as the Pope, on the White House website, which has caused a lot of backlash, but also not backlash in some circles in the United States. But he also put a picture of himself as a king quite recently, and long live the king. And next year, of course, is the 250th anniversary of US independence and from Great Britain and from the King, Mad King George, and Trump is obviously trying to describe himself as King Donald in this next phase. So we've gone full circle in 250 years. But this is one of the reasons why Trump is so fixated on Putin, because Putin has turned the presidency into basically the equivalent of the Russian Tsar. So that's on the one hand. The other hand is that Trump sees the world in very similar terms to Vladimir Putin as a world of spheres of influence and a world where might makes right and where there are only a handful of sovereign powers that really can exert their will on the rest of the world. And you've also noticed that Trump has talked about running the country and running the world at the moment. And he talks about, of course, acquiring Greenland, which he means this. Canada as the 51st state, he means this as well, and obviously Panama and the Panama Canal Zone. And he talks about dividing the world up into spheres of influence, just like Putin has. This has not been the talk of previous US presidents for an extraordinarily long time now. I would say, I always thought that the US was moving in a different direction over the last 30, 40 years. But Trump wants to bring it back again. So actually his interest in sitting down with Putin is, I think he wants to reenact in many respects the famous picture from Yalta, where you had Roosevelt and Stalin and Churchill. And in this case, Trump is also very interested in adding President Xi in China into the mix as well, and dividing, the kind of world off into these various spheres of influence. He talks about this, quite openly. And that gets us to, really what he thinks that he is doing, in part with the his desire to sit down with Vladimir Putin over Ukraine. Ukraine is simply something to be divided up in this kind of worldview. But also for Trump, there is another element in this, that he sees Ukraine as an obstacle to be able to reset the relationship with Putin and with Russia. He goes back again to the 1980s, thinking that the United States and the Soviet Union, he thinks of Russia as the Soviet Union, as Putin also does, were on a different trajectory for improving their relationships, and they were going to do all kinds of business deals. Remember, he visited the Soviet Union in Moscow in 1987, at the height of the Gorbachev period, when the United States and the Soviet Union were in the midst of thinking about expanding their relationships. And at that time, Trump obviously had the desire to build Trump Tower and to have economic and other business deals. He's never changed that mind. But the other element of this was against the backdrop of the major arms control negotiations. And this is where I think Trump is actually misunderstood, and where I'm a little bit more sympathetic towards his view, based on my experience in the first administration, where I'm quite negative on most of the other things that I saw there. Trump, I think, was deeply affected, as I personally was, and maybe many of you here were, by the Euro missile crisis of the 1980s. So I decided to study Russian in 1984 when I was a young person in Northern England, because of the thought that perhaps we might be obliterated in a nuclear exchange between the Soviet Union and the United States. 1984 was right at the midst, the peak, or 1983 and 1984 of the Euro missile war scare, the peak of the Cold War. And you may remember that we had that standoff from 1977 to 1987 over the stationing of new categories of strategic and intermediate nuclear missiles in Europe. And that was kind of Europe's version of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which must have affected Trump as a young person. He would have been 10 or 12 at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so, that was the period where there was a hope that, in fact, we would not just have arms reduction, but maybe an arms control, but maybe even get rid of nuclear weapons. And remember Gorbachev and Reagan on the way to signing the INF Treaty, which they did in 1987, just before I went there actually as a student and before Trump visited. There was a whole idea that during their summit in Reykjavik or Geneva and Helsinki and elsewhere that they might even talk about getting rid of nuclear weapons altogether. And Trump is actually fixated with that period, and he wants to sit down with Putin and actually negotiate arms control deals. And when he was with Zelensky, President Zelensky of Ukraine, in the Oval Office during that dreadful episode of the meeting together, he told Zelensky that Zelensky was gambling with World War III. And what he really meant was, you're getting in the way of me being able to sit down with Putin and talk about nuclear weapons. It's also part of why he wants to sit down with Iran and also with North Korea. There's a pattern there. Now, he seems to have missed that India and Pakistan might be, kind of on the verge of a nuclear exchange, and he doesn't really think about France or the UK as nuclear powers. He does think about China, and ultimately I think he also wants to make a deal with China on nuclear weapons, in which he would be quite willing to probably give up Taiwan, because as a real estate guy, he thinks it's all about territory or about property, and, kind of that isn't such a big issue. But, for him, the greatest catastrophe is the prospect of a nuclear exchange. He said that openly. I heard him say it many times in meetings. When people tried to tell him it's climate change, he would always say, which was the idea of the 1980s, of course, that the biggest, most catastrophic climate change would be a nuclear winter as a result of nuclear Armageddon. So he's actually very focused and very much shaped on all of those developments of the 1980s. So what he wants is a ceasefire. He wants to put Ukraine to one side, and he wants to move on with his reset of relations with Putin, who personally he's very focused on and fixated on having a good relationship with. So it's not really about Ukraine at all, and I don't think he really cares about what happens to Ukraine over the longer term, which of course is something of great concern to Europe.
So, and finally, in a sense, this would be the time for Europe. I mean, as an alternative, as a possibility of really establishing its own strategic autonomy, and at the same time being a country, a continent which can also align with its all those countries which want to keep, let's say, like Canada or many others, a liberal democratic regime and let's say the ideas of enlightenment. What should Europe do then?
Well, look, I think Europe has to prioritize its own security. And I think you've all had a lesson in how vulnerable Europe is, irrespective of what the cause was, by the blackout here in Madrid a week ago. Because I've been helping the UK government with its strategic defence review over the last year. And the biggest vulnerability for Europe, beyond, obviously the aggression from Russia against Ukraine, is really in critical national infrastructure. And frankly, that could easily, I don't think it was, but it could quite easily have been a sabotage attack, because Russia is heavily engaged in sabotage around Europe at this moment. Assassinations and all kinds of other subversive activities, taking on members of mafia groups or organized crime, to carry out and conduct operations, Bulgarians and Serbians, for example. There's been a number of incidents that have been attributed very clearly to Russia in the Baltic states and in Poland, in the Czech Republic and in the United Kingdom, very clearly. We've also seen, of course, the dragging of anchors by Chinese trawlers operating out of Russian ports. These are Chinese flag trawlers with Russians on board, rupturing undersea cables in the Baltic Sea. And, the blocking of GPS, that happened actually recently with an Azeri flight over Russia. You remember the Azerbaijan Airlines flight that crashed eventually in Kazakhstan. We've had lots of incidents of GPS being blocked for commercial and other military flights over Europe. There's just an unrelenting assault. It's not just in propaganda and psychological operations. And here in Spain, the Russians were heavily involved in trying to influence the outcome of the independence vote in Catalonia, for example. I mean, it's not just the Spanish government that got information about this, it's others trying to manipulate the Brexit vote back in 2016, although I think that would have happened without their manipulation. And, obviously, the attacks on Alexei Navalny with Novichok. We also saw, of course, an attack on the Skripal family of Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia in Salisbury, which killed a British woman, Dawn Sturgis, who her and her partner got hold of the Novichok in the perfume bottle, and there was enough Novichok of this, highly weaponized nerve agent to kill the whole town of Salisbury. And many other people were affected negatively by that attack as well. And it just showed a brazen disregard for the population of that town. Similarly, with the polonium use against Alexander Litvinenko, which spread, basically a weapons-grade, radiological element all the way around London. So look, this is serious stuff. And we know that the Russians are building up their military they've basically militarized the economy now. And I think for Putin, he can't really afford to stop that. So if you look back to the collapse of the Soviet Union, in the 1990s, Russia tried to move away from a militarized economy. And, they actually succeeded for a period of time. But now Putin has doubled down on militarizing the economy. 40% of the economy is now devoted to military production. They have Iran building massive drone factories in Russia. Obviously, we've seen the use of 10,000 plus North Korean soldiers. They've had the support of China in this war. And if the United States is shifting, to Russia's side, that leaves Europe exposed to Russia. And, kind of Europe in a position where it's going to have to ask the Chinese and the North Koreans and Iranians, what are they doing? Basically engaged in the largest military action in European in a European theatre since World War II. And just in this last week, the British military and intelligence have estimated that Russia has basically had 900,000 casualties in this war. 900,000 casualties. Think about that for a moment. That's not all killed, but severely wounded. That's far in excess of anything that happened in Afghanistan or the war in Chechnya. And it shows that Putin has a complete disregard, as I said in my presentation, for human life. That's a cost he is willing to pay because he wants to dominate Ukraine, and frankly, he would like to dominate again Eastern Europe and Moldova and Belarus and many of the other former states of the Soviet Union. And look, the Swedes, the Finns, the Baltic states, the Poles, who are spending now 4.7%, soon to be 5% of GDP on their defence, the UK, Norway, many other countries realise there's a real threat here. And even if Spain is far away and probably not likely to be subjected to ballistic missiles and drone, kind of warfare in the way that, Ukraine has been, other countries do face that risk. And Spain is very vulnerable, as we've already seen, for critical national infrastructure. If an accident can take down the grid, a saboteur can take down the grid as well. It was the same with Heathrow Airport. Again, that looks like it was an accident, but research is being done into this. But you can already see acts of sabotage. The Russians really mean business, and I've learned that the hard way myself. So we have to be serious about it. And even if the United States is wanting to leave, I think we have to be very clear in trying to work with the United States to bridge, to the ability of Europe to be able to take charge of its own affairs. And, for the European members of NATO, Article 3 of the NATO treaty, the NATO Charter, is explicit. The countries should be able to defend themselves. They should be resilient and able to basically defend their own critical national infrastructure and their own way of life, as well as actually being able to contribute under Article 5 to the collective defence of others. So, I'm not suggesting that, in Spain you should expect to see Russian tanks, kind of appearing over the Pyrenees, but you could be, very much subjected to acts of, sabotage that could have a devastating effect, as we just, saw last week with what appears to be being an accident.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's start with any questions that you may have. En español o en inglés, en español, y ella entiende bastante bien español y si no lo traducimos. Por favor. Aquí.
Oh, maybe here.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mi pregunta es, ¿qué hace?
My question is what to do when we make politics very political.
Question, because I think we have to start to think at the grassroots about how to address this. Because many of the people who are voting for the extremist parties, and I mentioned my home region in the UK of County Durham, are doing so because they feel that nobody listens to them. And that was the same with Brexit. It was really a protest vote. So I think what we're going to have to do is to have our politicians be more in contact with their constituencies in the regions which they represent. I basically also have to be able to have a national conversation with the population about the challenges that the country faces. And this is why I mentioned also education, because I think universities and institutes can play a role. And when I was in Germany, I interviewed the German Bundespräsident, so the president of Germany, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, who used to be the foreign minister under the previous SPD government. And Steinmeier had realized himself, he worked more in the foreign policy realm, and obviously he was one of the people who'd been responsible for Germany's efforts to really change the relationship with Russia. But he realized in his role as the president, who of course doesn't really have much constitutional power, but is the representative of the state, that the government was very much out of touch with the people. And after the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Vest movement in France, he noted how President Macron had gone around the country doing these town halls, which were quite effective in taking down the temperature of the political anger, although they didn't necessarily change the politics after this. But there was a response, a quite positive response to Macron going around the country. So Steinmeier decided to do this himself. And when I interviewed him back in 2023, he'd started to go to all of the places around the country that had voted more heavily for the Alternative for Deutschland, so for the right-wing parties, and to meet with people on a random basis, which was very interesting. So there's a number of institutions and educational foundations like the Hertie School in Berlin that have started to look at different ways of approaching democratic institutions and looking at the idea of selecting people randomly from the electoral rolls to take part in discussions with parliamentarians. And so he worked with the Hertie School and the Bertelsmann Foundation, also the Robert Bosch Academy where I was located, and selected people who wouldn't necessarily come to meet with him under normal circumstances. Because under normal circumstances, people would select themselves. If you knew that Steinmeier was there, you might get a ticket to go to see him, but you wouldn't, do this unless you were interested. So they actually sent letters to people and had people go to knock on the doors of people who didn't respond and sent emails out to try to encourage people to come to meet with him. And he found that they had a very positive experience. They'd pick one topic because they wanted to make sure that there was some follow-on after it. And they got very positive results from this in focus groups, but they didn't do enough of it quickly enough. And Frank Steinmeier said he regretted deeply that they hadn't done more of this more quickly, because they realized that this was really, it was an important part to show up and to listen to people and try to show to people that things were being done. And so there was a big contrast that I discovered between the Ruhr region, where there was so much more investment over a long period of time in these kinds of activities, and in East Germany, where this was just started by Steinmeier and others rather late, after there'd already been a lot of votes for the more extremist right-wing political figures. But it showed that you could actually make a difference. And if you look at the United States, one of the reasons that people vote for Trump is because he shows up. He travels around the country to all of these rallies. And if he's actually doing anything, people think, well, he showed up. And one of the reasons people didn't vote for Biden and Kamala Harris, and of course, you know, it was because they didn't show up. You know, kind of during, obviously Biden, as we saw, was quite infirm and not capable of traveling around the country. But Kamala Harris made the same mistakes that Hillary Clinton made. She didn't show up to all of the places that were most likely, kind of to vote for Trump. And so I think, you know, part of politics and part of dealing with this polarization is to show up at places and to talk to people and to listen to them. And this is actually one of the reasons that Reform has been elected in the northeast of England. Many of the new candidates for Reform are actually from the region, which they weren't previously. And both the Labour and Tory party previously just used to select people from their party lists and send them there. And Reform never got any seats that way because people thought of them really as extremists. The same with Alternative for Deutschland. Initially, they were mostly people from other parts of Germany, but they started to get more traction when they found local candidates. And most of the Reform candidates now are people who are from those regions who feel the grievances of the people and actually went around talking to people. So this is, I think, is a real lesson to all of us that we need to engage more directly. And again, we can do this with institutions, we can do this with foundations, we can do it, you know, through educational institutions, because Steinmeier started to work with whatever institutions was there locally. And it was also, as I said, very clear that places that had more educational institutions and had more outreach to the local population had much less votes for Alternative for Deutschland in Germany as well.
Una pregunta aquí y luego allí también.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I certainly take your. I'm German, by the way.
Yeah.
I certainly take your point on education, which you made. I myself, may I say, I'm a product of education from the 60s and 70s in Germany. No, Schmidt, Brandt, and all the social liberal government. But allow me to disagree with you, Ms. Steinmeier. Okay. Yeah, because if you take our latest election results, so Steinmeier seemed not to have much success in the East, because if you see the East, it is completely blue with AfD. So what success did Steinmeier have in the East with all his talks to the people? But let me ask you something else. I read somewhere that you would have said that in the Helsinki talk, Trump and Putin would have led Trump into a trap. In which trap did Putin lead Trump?
Very good. Well, actually, Steinmeier actually said that he himself said he hadn't done enough. When I interviewed him, he was worried that he hadn't done enough. And I think those results show that they didn't do enough. Because they got very positive feedback from the places they went to, but they didn't go everywhere. And he was just one person doing this. They actually tried to get more German politicians to go to the regions, and many of them didn't go. And there was also an effort to get, which I was quite surprised that German politicians didn't necessarily do this, more people to go to meet with their constituencies. There was a rather strangely named project that, again, some of the other institutions were doing called Hello Bundestag. Sounds a little bit like Hello in the magazine here in Hola, and then Hello the magazine in Spain and the UK. Because it turns out that members of the Bundestag didn't go regularly to meet with their constituents. And so that was also a problem. I mean, in the US, the Republicans have stopped doing this because of a backlash, you know, from their constituents about what's happening. But also there was a lot of fear in the United States about meeting with constituents and getting assassinated after, you know, some of the shooting incidents. But there was an effort to try to get the Bundestag members to go and meet. And that, again, you know, I was doing these interviews in 2023 and they obviously didn't do enough. So I think that what you just said is actually underscores that you need to do more, and you need to do it consistently. You need to be really serious about it at all levels. There can't just be one person, you know, going around, because, as you said, you can show that actually the exact thing they were frightened about actually happened. So the Alternative for Deutschland took off in the East because there was not enough attention paid to this. Now, in terms of the trap in Helsinki, well, Trump fell into many traps in Helsinki because, you know, part of it is he's so eager to talk to Putin because he wanted imagine himself sitting down like Gorbachev and Reagan and basically having the beginning of a negotiation over arms control. And of course, that's not what happened. And what Putin really wanted to do was to, pull, Trump off into a different direction, to reset the US-Russia relationship, but also to make him look bad at that time, and also to set Trump off against the people around him. Because just before we met with Putin in Helsinki, there was the ongoing investigation by Mueller, the former head of the FBI, into the Russian interference in the US election in 2016. And of course, the Mueller report showed that the Russian secret services and the services from the GRU, the military intelligence, had been very active. And just before we went to Helsinki, there had been the indictment and the naming of several Russian GRU officers who'd been involved in the interventions and the operations in the United States. And Putin basically then suggested to Trump, who hadn't been following most of the things that had been happening, that Russia would allow the United States to interrogate these GRU officers if Trump would allow him to interrogate people who'd been involved in corruption in Russia in the US government. And then the prosecutor general in Russia had issued this list. It didn't tell Trump who this was. It included the former ambassador, US ambassador to Russia, and a whole list of people who hadn't been involved in corruption at all, but had been involved in the setup of the Magnitsky Act, which was an act to investigate corruption and abuses of human rights in Russia by corrupt Russian officials after the death of a lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, who had been representing Bill Browder, a former US investor in Russia, and after his company had been taken over by corrupt Russian interests. So Putin twisted all of this around. It became a massive scandal for Trump because it looked like he was agreeing to the interrogation of his former ambassador, or the US former ambassador, and a whole host of some contemporary at the time US officials. But the other thing was, of course, that Trump himself fell into a trap that wasn't really laid by Putin at all, but journalists, asking Trump if he would denounce Putin, when he was on the stage with him for interfering in the elections. And of course, Trump didn't want to do anything of the sort. He didn't want to be embarrassed in front of Putin. He didn't want to, admit that Putin had interfered in the elections, because he didn't want to believe that Putin had interfered in the elections. And of course, he told everybody in the press conference that he believed Putin over his security agencies. And even Putin thought that Trump had gone too far. And on the way out of the press conference, it was a little bit set up like this, with the two of them talking at podiums, and they exited over here. And I had to get up from my seat at the side here, and I was walking behind Putin, who was talking to his press secretary. And basically, Putin said in Russian, "Takoy bardak," and bardak translates literally as a brothel, but it basically means "what a shit show" in Russian. And so even Putin thought that Trump had gone too far, and that there would be a backlash from the things that Trump had said, and there was. And that was frustrating to Putin, because he'd hoped to be, for himself, taking advantage of the way that he could manipulate Trump and put the kind of the US-Russia relationship on the track that we actually see it now. So this was long before things had happened in Ukraine.
Yo creo que tenemos para una pregunta más. Tiempo para una pregunta.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Well, thank you very much, Mrs. Hill, for your excellent expose. I have two questions. I'm going to try to make them very short. The first is that you spoke a little bit about it. What are the possibilities that NATO has if the US does not participate, as it is foreseeable, in a hypothetical attack to Latvia, Lithuania, and also you've spoken about resilience in education. We're very interested in the situation in the US. Harvard has a lot of private support and can survive in the short term, but not the other universities that are publicly supported. So I'm very interested in knowing your opinion in your resilience in the judiciary power in the U.S.?
What would happen if, it's an attack on
yeah, and
Baltics?
the risk on the Baltic states.
And the second is about resilience in public universities.
Yes.
And the judiciary particularly.
And the judiciary, yes, I thought it was as well, yeah. So in the case of a possible attack on the Baltic states, there's already been lots of sabotage attacks and efforts by the Russian intelligence to engage in acts of subversion, and the Estonians have actually arrested a very large number of people, somewhere in the realm of about 20, Russian agents that they now have in prison. So the Estonians in particular are very serious about this and very, kind of worried about all the different things, the kind of hybrid warfare, which is a combination of, these acts of sabotage and, real warfare at the same time. So, I mean, the Baltic states are under constant attack in any case in different forms. And so what we've seen is the forward deployment, and I think Spain also has some troops in the Baltic states, but with lead nations of the United Kingdom, Canada and Germany, taking responsibility respectively for Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. And of course the Baltic states also see that their security runs through Ukraine, just like many other countries see that as well. And the Baltic states have pretty much handed over every weapon system that they have to the Ukrainians and are very worried now about their own, insecurity as a result of that. So, they are hoping that the European, NATO members will continue to support them to deter the Russians from taking any action. So when we think about European security, what we have to do is restore deterrence. None of us want to see a war. I certainly don't. And I think, what we're looking at is that idea of peace through strength, which is what the Finns, in particular Finland, has always been concerned about. The Finns have the largest standing army in Europe, and they have the reserve capability, to bring up, several 100,000, men and women under arms in a crisis. And they always did this because they had to be self-reliant to make sure that they would deter the Russians from ever taking any kind of action. The Finns have moved out of the Ottawa Convention, against cluster bombs. They've been thinking about basically mining their entire border. This is the Finns, who we always think about the nicest people in Europe, but they're very serious about their security, and that's really what we have to be as well. So we're trying to deter Russia from doing anything more, and that's what the Baltic states hope. And of course, the Poles, in increasing their defence, to be able to, deter Russia from thinking about doing anything in Poland. And frankly, the Ukrainians have been doing something quite miraculous in having fought Russia essentially to a standstill and inflicted such a cost on Russia, because Putin thought he would take Ukraine in a few days, if not a few weeks, and that didn't happen. And before we got involved, we were at large in helping Ukraine, the Ukrainians were fighting for themselves. And I think they've shown that, they are capable of doing so, but what we have to do is deter, the Russians from doing anything, like you're saying in the Baltic states or anywhere else for that matter. And in a way, and that links to your, second question, because with universities and so much of civil society under attack in the United States, they're also going to have to take measures of standing in solidarity themselves to push back. And look, it's very fair to say that Trump has recognized that there are very big problems in the United States. And many of the people who are supporting Trump were supporting him because they want to see their problems addressed. But of course, what Trump is doing is also undermining the fundamentals of US democracy. And I think, there's a good 30+% of people in the United States would be quite happy to see an autocracy, an authoritarian state there, just as many people in Russia, wanted to see the same. They wanted to see Putin be their champion and do things for them. People vote for Alternative for Deutschland because they want an alternative for Germany, their Germany. When I was in Germany, I was interviewing members of the AfD, and they said they wanted their Germany. They didn't want a Germany of immigrants. They didn't want a Germany that was in the European Union. They didn't want a Germany that was in a hostile relationship with Russia. They wanted a different Germany, and they wanted a Germany where things were done for them. So where they would get basically the benefits of that Germany. And that's what, you're seeing for the people who are supporting Trump. And they see universities actually as not serving their purposes because they don't see education as providing something from them. And, I think that that's also incumbent upon the universities like Harvard and others to start to think, about how they expand access to education in all kinds of forms. Harvard has an educational school. It has a whole host of researchers like Raj Chetty and a team who actually won the Nobel Prize for their work into poverty and inequality, who actually have come up with all kinds of answers, that get to the heart of this issue about how to tackle inequality. And so I think that, it's incumbent upon the university to actually do something about this at the same time. And I think that's starting to happen. You saw that, Harvard, for example, made an announcement in the last week about their task forces on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. They've talked about tackling some of the problems internally. They've actually made Harvard accessible for any student who's admitted whose family makes less than $100,000 or $200,000. I got a full scholarship from Harvard when I went there because my family had no means. And they're trying to then also expand that access to the Harvard system. They've joined in with MIT to create a platform for expanding the Harvard classes through an online platform called Axim that they've now made available for community colleges and for state public universities that don't have the resources of Harvard and can't teach all of the subjects, for example. And they're trying to make that, kind of available globally. So at the same time that they have to push back against the efforts of the Trump administration to control them and dictate, what they should be teaching and how they should be teaching, it's also incumbent upon them to bandy together, I think, to reform the educational sector. And we're starting to see that happen out of necessity. And frankly, I think the same thing is going to have to happen in the United Kingdom, in Germany and elsewhere. And, perhaps that's also a theme you could look at here in Spain. I think you have broader access to education in Spain, but the question is it the kind of access to the kind of education that's going to be suitable for people to adapt to the current challenges? Because there's still a lot of inequality here in Spain. And look, I know from my own niece, who is a student here, that she doesn't feel that the educational system is really giving her the kinds of skills that she needs, to kind of deal with the rapid changes. And we're seeing changes in the information and knowledge economy. It's going to be like, my father, in the mines, they're not going to need, some of the jobs that people have been studying at university for in the very near future. It is going to be the case that AI, will fill in with some of the, the basic functions that we thought of people, doing before in accounting and, in some of the office kinds of jobs that can be done in a different way. We'll still need all kinds of, other professions, but we're going to have to really think about the future of work and how to, adapt our educational systems to this as well. So that's also going to be part of resilience for education, because Trump's saying, education is the problem now. 60% of the population don't get educated, so let's close down universities, or let's, make universities do, certain things. He's actually undermining the ability of education to adapt and to come up with, new approaches. So, I think universities are going to have to do that for themselves. And I presume that the Fundación Ramón Areces and, kind of counterparts at Harvard will be, thinking about this as well.
Muy bien, hemos llegado al final de nuestra conversación.
Well, thank you very much. We got to the end of our conversation. I would like to thank especially Fundación Ramón Areces and Fiona Hill for being here with us. We could go on, and it's a pity we cannot answer all the questions. We could be here for hours because there's so many important topics that Fiona Hill has an enormous and very interesting opinion. We are in turbulent times. We were saying interesting times, maybe too interesting, but we need more and more people with this capacity, and it is a call for everyone in that commitment with education, with reflection, with knowledge, and public commitment. Thank you very much, Fiona Hill. So, a big round of applause.